Okay, let's dive into this. We've got China and the Philippines um, planting their national flags on the same really tiny sandbars in the South China Sea.
Yeah, it sounds almost, I don't know, symbolic. Maybe even a bit like kids claiming territory in a sandbox.
Exactly. But as we'll see, these aren't just gestures. They carry, well, a lot of weight in terms of geopolitical tension.
That contrast is what's so interesting, isn't it? How something that looks so small, maybe even a bit absurd on the surface, is actually packed with meaning.
Yeah, a real flashpoint in a much bigger, much more serious struggle.
Absolutely.
So for this deep dive, we're really focusing in on these specific flag incidents on Sandy Cay. We're using a recent CNN report that does a good job laying out what happened and, importantly, why it matters.
Right.
And our mission here, for you listening, is really to cut through the noise. Let's figure out why this happened, what it tells us about the friction, the ongoing stuff in the South China Sea, and what the fallout might be.
And it's important to remember the South China Sea isn't some quiet corner of the world.
No, definitely not.
It's a massive shipping lane, resources are huge, and well, it's where territorial claims from a bunch of countries just crash into each other. These little sandbars, like Sandy Cay, they're right on the front line.
Okay, so let's get specific. What actually went down on Sandy Cay? Tell us about the event itself.
Okay, so the CNN report traces it back to mid-April. That's when Chinese state media first announced their Coast Guard had done patrols.
On Sandy Cay.
Well, on what they call Texian Reef. That's their name for Sandy Cay. They said it was about asserting sovereign jurisdiction.
And they put out pictures?
Yeah, photos of uniformed officers, Chinese flag planted right there on one of these little sandbars. They also mentioned cleanup activities, patrols, sort of establishing a presence.
Okay. And then the Philippines responded. How quickly?
Pretty fast, actually. Just a couple of weeks later, April 27th, the Philippine Coast Guard announced they'd deployed teams
To the same place.
to the very same place. They called them Pag-asa 1, 2, and 3. It's a string of 3 sandbars, uninhabited, and crucially, they're really close to a Philippine military outpost.
Legasa Island, right? Thitu Island.
That's the one. So a very sensitive spot.
So we've got the Filipinos arriving in, what, small boats,
Mm-hmm.
planting their flag.
Yep. The report mentions 4 teams deployed in rubber boats, and the CNN piece notes they weren't exactly alone out there.
Ah, okay. What did they see?
The Philippine Coast Guard said they observed a China Coast Guard ship nearby, and also 7 Chinese maritime militia vessels sort of hanging around.
Maritime militia. Those are the fishing boats that aren't always just fishing boats.
Basically, yeah, often civilian vessels, but they coordinate with the state. It adds this whole other layer, ambiguity to these encounters. Their presence really highlights the constant watching, the asserting of control in that area.
And China's reaction to the Philippine flag planting? I'm guessing they weren't pleased?
No, predictably not. China's Coast Guard came out almost immediately, called the Philippine landing illegal.
Illegal.
Okay.
Yeah. A spokesperson said the Filipinos landed despite warnings and that Chinese law enforcement then boarded the reef themselves to, quote, verify and deal with the situation.
So you have these 2 completely opposite stories about the same event happening at the same time.
Exactly. It's claim versus counterclaim right there on the sand. It really is like a high-stakes game of capture the flag almost. Okay, so that's the what. Let's zoom out a bit. Why does this tiny incident matter so much? What's the bigger geopolitical picture?
Well, it all comes back to the core issue, these overlapping claims in the South China Sea. It's not just China and the Philippines.
Right, you've got Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei.
Taiwan, too,
Yeah.
all claiming parts of this waterway. But China's claim is, well, vast. They claim almost the entire sea based on their historical maps.
The 9-dash line or now the 10-dash line, I think.
Essentially, yeah, it covers something like 80%, maybe more, of the South China Sea. And crucially, there was that international court ruling a few years back.
The one that invalidated a lot of China's claims.
Precisely. Legally binding, but Beijing just refuses to recognize it. Hasn't changed their stance at all.
They haven't just been talking, have they? They've been busy building.
Oh, definitely. For the last decade or 2, China's been doing massive land reclamation, basically turning submerged reefs and tiny atolls into much larger artificial islands.
And putting military stuff on them.
Yes. Runways long enough for military aircraft, deep water ports, radar systems, missile emplacements. It's transformed the physical and strategic landscape out there, and it's caused a lot of alarm, understandably.
In Sandy Cay, specifically, the CNN report links it closely to Thitu Island, Pag-asa Island. Why is that link significant?
Thitu, or Pagasa, is the largest island the Philippines occupies in the Spratlys. It has a military facility, a small civilian population.
And they recently added something else there.
Yes, in 2023, they set up a Coast Guard monitoring base, specifically, they said, to counter Chinese aggression. So Sandy Cay is right next door, practically, to this key Philippine outpost that's actively watching Chinese movements.
Which brings the U.S. into the picture, doesn't it? The military and political side of things.
Absolutely. The U.S. and the Philippines have a mutual defense treaty. It's old, but it's active.
And the current U.S. administration, the Biden administration, has been pretty clear about it applying in the South China Sea.
Very clear. They've repeatedly stated that an armed attack on Philippine armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft, including those of its Coast Guard in the South China Sea, would invoke U.S. mutual defense commitments.
Now, the CNN report mentions the previous administration, the Trump administration. Their view on alliances was maybe a bit different.
Yeah, the report notes that President Trump often talked about alliances in more transactional terms, what's in it for the U.S. But at the same time, his administration also had some very strong voices, people sometimes called China hawks, like Hegseth and Rubio mentioned in the report.
Right, who were pushing for a tougher line against China's actions.
Exactly. So even then, there was this push to be more assertive in the region. It wasn't uniform, but that element was definitely there.
And all this is playing out against the backdrop of these big military drills. Balakatan.
Yes, the annual Balakatan exercises, which means shoulder to shoulder in Tagalog. They kicked off just before these flag incidents, actually.
And these weren't just small drills this year.
No, they were huge, the largest ever, apparently. 3 weeks long, involving thousands of troops, and getting more complex.
What was particularly noteworthy this year?
Well, a couple things. For the first time, the U.S. deployed a ground-based missile system capable of hitting ships onto the northern Philippines.
Northern Philippines, so closer to Taiwan.
Very close, relatively speaking. That sends a pretty clear signal about the kind of scenarios they're practicing for.
A signal aimed at Beijing, presumably.
You'd have to assume so, yeah. Also, Japan participated fully for the first time, not just as observers.
Okay, so you're seeing this deepening security cooperation between the U.S., Philippines, Japan.
Right. It reflects these shared concerns about China's growing military power and assertiveness in the region, especially in the maritime domain.
The CNN report also mentions the U.S. Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, visiting Asia recently. What did he say?
During that trip, Secretary Hegseth made a point of vowing to enhance the alliance with the Philippines. His words were about wanting to reestablish deterrence against, quote, China's aggression.
Strong words.
Very strong. It underlines the U.S. commitment, certainly rhetorically, to push back against what it sees as China destabilizing the region.
Okay, so we've laid out the scene. The flags, the history, the claims, the military buildup, the alliances. Let's circle back to why this matters for you, the listener. Why should we care about flags on sandbars?
Well, first off, it's way more than just symbolism, even though the PR battle who looks like they're in control is definitely part of it.
Right, it's a visual assertion of sovereignty.
Exactly. But the real significance is how easily these small actions can ramp up tensions. They further strain the already difficult relationship between China and the Philippines.
It increased the risk of what?
Yeah.
An accident, miscalculation.
Precisely. When you have Coast Guard vessels, maybe militia vessels, potentially naval vessels, all operating in close proximity in contested waters, the chances of something going wrong, a collision, a confrontation, they just go up.
And given the U.S. Defense Treaty, a small incident could potentially spiral.
That's the concern, yeah. It really puts the U.S. commitment to the test. How does Washington respond when these kinds of gray zone tactics, these assertive but maybe just below the threshold of armed attack actions, happen?
So the CNN report suggests this is a test case, in a way, for how the current U.S. administration will handle this kind of thing in the Indo-Pacific.
It certainly seems that way. Every incident like this forces choices, and those choices send signals across the region to allies to China. It's about credibility.
And connecting it globally. The South China Sea isn't just a regional issue, is it?
Absolutely not. Trillions of dollars in trade pass through there every year. Freedom of navigation is critical for the global economy. So instability or conflict there has potentially massive worldwide repercussions. It remains one of the key places to watch.
Okay, so wrapping this up, these flag incidents on Sandy Cay, they might seem small, almost like a footnote.
Yeah, easy to miss in the headlines.
But they're actually a really clear snapshot of this much bigger, much more tense situation in the South China Sea. You've got the competing claims, the military posturing, the alliances, all playing out right there.
It's the whole complex dynamic just miniaturized onto these tiny bits of sand.
So maybe a final thought for you to chew on. What does this act, planting a flag, which seems so simple, really tell us about how countries compete today, especially in these contested zones?
Yeah. And are there other things happening, maybe seemingly symbolic acts elsewhere in the world that actually carry a much deeper meaning about power and potential conflict?
Definitely worth thinking about. We really encourage you to keep following what's happening in the South China Sea. It's complex, it's evolving, and it really does matter for global stability. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.